Before we begin, please let us know where you are located. She was humiliated and kicked out of her seat, but minutes later, the same flight attendant who had shamed her was facing consequences. No one could have predicted that this flight would change everything, not only for the people on board, but for the entire airline. Ava Carter wore a tailored blazer over a sleek dress, her natural curls framing her face. In one hand, she held a leather laptop. If you enjoyed stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Today, viewers will be watching. With one boarding card in her other hand, she strode down the aisle, checking the seat numbers as she went. Ava exuded an air of quiet resolve, her posture serene and collected, but she clearly wasn't the kind to be rattled easily. Finally, she arrived at her settled into her first-class seat. She smiled courteously to the neighboring passenger, tucked her carry-on into the overhead compartment, and sat down to take notes. Her mind was completely absorbed in her work, and she was blissfully unaware of her surroundings. In response to the sometimes curious looks she would get from others around her, a few seconds later, flight attendant Miranda Scott strode quickly around the cabin, her sharp uniform revealing an inspection of every customer she encountered. Something about Ava piqued Miranda's interest, but she didn't say what it was. Miranda then stepped closer, pausing just behind Ava's seat. "Excuse me," Miranda began with a courteous but somewhat agitated tone. "Can I see?" Miranda read the ticket and somewhat scowled. This was for first class, right? Ava glanced up, astonished but unconcerned, and handed out her boarding card with a little grin. "Simply," Ava responded, her voice level. Indeed, Miranda's expression became more serious, as if she were attempting to make a mental reconciliation. Following a short pause, she returned the boarding pass silently, her lips curled into a tight line. Her demeanor, however, indicated that she was far from finished. In the meantime, Ava shrugged off the interaction and went back to her notes. She was engrossed in her writing, oblivious to the fact that Miranda was discreetly conversing with another flight attendant nearby, exchanging looks back and forth. Even from a distance, the stress on Miranda's face was palpable. Eventually, Miranda reappeared, this time accompanied by Ava rose up, her laptop bag in tow, and followed Miranda into the galley, where first-class passengers exchanged interested glances and spoke among themselves, displaying a more authoritative attitude. "Miss Carter, could you kindly step aside for a moment? I need to confirm something." Ava blinked, astonished but composed. Standing poised in the cramped room, Ava patiently awaited Miranda's words. "It appears there may have been an error with your booking," Miranda said, folding her arms. "I don't think there was an error," Ava responded with a slight tilt of her head. Miranda's tone became more icy as she said, "I don't think this seat is appropriate for you. I'll have to ask you to take a seat in the main cabin." The words lingered in the air, and for the next several weeks, I would want to reschedule my ticket. Miranda's voice became stiff as she asked Ava, "I don't understand. My ticket is valid. Why would I need to move?" Ava's expression moved from surprise to irritation, but she soon recovered her calm. Quietly, Ava returned to her seat to grab her luggage, while the whole cabin appeared to be watching, the murmuring becoming louder. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security to assist," she said, her voice becoming more angry. Ava was accompanied by Miranda as she made her way to the rear of the aircraft. She could see other people trailing after her, so she kept her head held high while gently tightening her grasp on her laptop bag. As they entered the main cabin, Miranda pointed to a vacant seat in the center. Ava tucked her suitcase behind the seat and sat down quietly. Miranda strode away, leaving Ava to adjust to her new small space. Ava gazed out the window, her expression composed despite the apparent chaos in her mind, which seemed to be a mix of anger and shock. Ava retrieved her belongings, and as Ava texted a message on her phone, a little grin crept onto the corners of her mouth. She sat silently in her new seat, her face inscrutable as the buzz of the jet engines filled the cabin. Ava remained utterly absorbed in her phone, skimming through her contacts and making a brief call while maintaining a low voice. A handful of passengers shot her sympathetic glances, while the majority swiftly averted their eyes, as if oblivious to the uncomfortable situation. She stopped the conversation as abruptly as she had begun it, putting the phone back into her luggage. "I need a favor. Something happened, and I would like it addressed immediately. Yes, I am still on the plane. No need to escalate just yet. Just watch for my signal." Sitting in first class, Miranda seemed to know something no one else did. She cheerfully checked on other passengers, smiled politely, and made sure their drinks were ready, but she couldn't help but think of Ava. As far as Miranda was concerned, she had handled the situation appropriately, but there was still a lingering doubt in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Ava glanced at the flight attendant assigned to the main cabin and noticed something about her composure that upset Miranda, though she couldn't quite pinpoint it. Clara, a younger lady, appeared more sympathetic than Miranda. She approached Ava with caution, offering a cup of water, and inquired, "Ma'am, is everything okay?" Clara's eyes betrayed her worry. Ava glanced up, her smile warm and genuine, but Ava's calm manner discouraged more prying, so Clara placed the water on Ava's tray and stepped away as the aircraft departed. "I'm fine, thank you. There was just a bit of a mix-up," Ava said. As Ava relaxed into her seat, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest, she watched the clouds outside the window. Miranda, meanwhile, continued to be blissfully ignorant of the domino effect her actions had set in motion. Ava's fury was always on the verge of exploding, but she preferred order to disorder and had already begun to formulate a strategy when, after 7 minutes, a voice crackled over the intercom, addressing the women and gently asking them to. Ava's expression was unreadable as she pulled out her notebook once again, jotting down a single line before saying, "We'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We hope you're enjoying your flight. If anything is needed, please don't hesitate to let one of our crew members know." Passengers settled into a calm rhythm with their books, movies, or quiet conversations as Ava remained still in her seat, her expression calm, but with an intensity that hinted at something. Whatever her next move was, she was clearly prepared for it. As she passed out drinks, Miranda glanced at the first section of the class and felt a tiny sense of victory. The problem had been resolved, and whatever discomfort it caused had been resolved. However, the past was far from forgotten. Underneath, though, she appeared more at ease, moving through her routine with practiced efficiency. The other passengers on the plane didn't bat an eye as Ava leaned forward in her seat and unlocked her phone once more. With her fingers hovering over the screen, she typed a brief cryptic message that read, "They'll call soon. Let me know when it's done." Although Ava's lips curled into a faint grin, the sharpness in her gaze would have unsettled Miranda if she had observed that Miranda approached the galley and had a brief conversation with another flight attendant, Dennis, near the front of the aircraft. With a subtle glance in Ava's direction, Dennis arched an eyebrow, asking, "Did you see that woman earlier?" Miranda questioned with a low voice, her voice barely audible, and Dennis sometimes served as a mentor to younger crew members. "I was sent to economy because," as Miranda explained, even though she had a first-class ticket, something about her seemed off. Dennis scowled and leaned against the counter, and Miranda paused, recognizing she had to. Dennis's scowl grew as he said, "Proceed with caution. I had a gut feeling. It's better to be safe than sorry." He then interrupted her, saying, "Just because you have a gut feeling doesn't mean you can bump into someone without cause." First-class passengers and the airline both disliked being moved, so Miranda was about to respond when the in-flight phone in the galley buzzed. Dennis, maintaining a neutral expression, picked up the phone and listened. He looked at her with a mixture of worry and wonder as he handed her the phone and said, "It's for you." Miranda's heart skipped a beat, and she paused before accepting the phone, her fingers clenching around the receiver. "This is Miranda," she murmured hesitantly, her voice filled with uncertainty. The other party spoke in a measured but assertive tone. "This is the Airline Executive Office. We have received a direct complaint regarding an incident involving a first-class passenger. Please provide a detailed report upon landing. In the meantime, we ask that you treat all passengers with the utmost care." With a hint of embarrassment, Miranda's face turned pale as she struggled to find the right words. "I will ensure that everything is handled appropriately," she stammered before hanging up her phone, her hand quivering slightly. Dennis observed her anxiously. His look was inscrutable. What was going on? Miranda mumbled something, but her tense voice betrayed her. She cast her gaze toward the main cabin, where Ava sat, and for the first time she felt a spark of unease pervaded Ava's demeanor as she sat silently, her notebook closed on her lap. It seemed as if the phone conversation had no impact on her. However, as Miranda resumed her tasks, a subtle grin spread over Ava's lips. Ava had only begun to turn the tide, and Miranda was just now starting to comprehend the impending storm. Determined to overcome her anxiety, she made her way through the cabin, but the phone call continued to haunt her thoughts. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't help but fix her gaze on Ava, who sat serenely in the main cabin, seemingly unfazed and at peace. She sat back in her seat, occasionally glancing at her watch, crossed her legs, and picked up the in-flight magazine, flipping through it absent-mindedly. To anyone watching, she looked relaxed, as though nothing about the situation bothered her. Ava's calm demeanor, as if she knew something Miranda didn't, was unsettling. Clara, the flight attendant, approached Ava once again, her kind manner a sharp contrast to Miranda's previous antagonism. "Excuse me, ma'am," she whispered. "Would you like anything to drink?" Despite the disruption to her day, she was certain that everything was going according to plan in her head. With a kind grin, Ava glanced up and offered Clara a cup of water. A few seconds later, Clara returned with a tiny napkin and set them gently on Ava's tray table. "If anything else you need, just let me know," she said, adding lovingly to Ava's eyes. As Clara glanced at her name tag, Ava's tone softened and her thanks real. Clara smiled slightly and walked away, leaving Ava to think about what to do next. Miranda, meantime, observed the exchange from a distance. She had a rising sense of anxiety because Ava's calm and courteous interactions with Clara didn't line up with the story Miranda had imagined. This troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She had an overwhelming want to take charge, but she knew she couldn't. With the call from the executive office having made it plain, Miranda knew she had to proceed with caution. As they cruised at 30,000 feet, the constant hum of the engines added to the mounting strain in her chest. Returning to the galley, she found Dennis furiously whipping up the next batch of. After a brief pause, Dennis glanced over at Miranda and said, "Refreshments, everything okay?" Miranda nodded curtly, but Dennis remained unconvinced, leaning in closer and spoke in a low voice. "You'd better hope you didn't mess with whoever this is," she replied. "First class isn't for amateurs, Miranda. These individuals have connections." Miranda tensed up at his comments but remained nothing. Instead, she preoccupied herself with cup arrangement, even if her thoughts were elsewhere. Dennis's warning had reached a sensitive spot for whom Ava's phone was gently buzzing on her lap, and she looked down at the screen, her face inscrutable. The message was brief, and they were all set. But why was Ava Carter truly like this? A few perceptive passengers noticed the slight tension between Miranda and Ava silently placed the phone back in her purse while sipping water. Her motions were slow, methodical, and leisurely, as if she had infinite time on her hands. A guy sitting opposite from her aisle leaned in close and whispered, "The flight attendant has been getting under your skin, hasn't she?" Ava glanced at him, her expression neutral, and whispered, "It's nothing I can't handle." The man arched an eyebrow, thinking there was more to the tale, but he chose to ignore it. Miranda was unaware of the far-reaching ramifications of her actions, and Ava, who refrained from pushing further, redirected her gaze to the window where she watched the seemingly infinite expanse of clouds. Behind her composed appearance, she felt a quiet contentment. During the first-class section, Miranda experienced a growing sense of unease as each minute felt like it stretched on forever. The weight of the previous phone call continued to weigh on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen, something she could control. The atmosphere in the cabin further intensified. As time went on, the plane stayed steady in the air, but Miranda's movements became stiffer. Her once confident stride was now accompanied by anxious glances. She attempted to occupy herself by checking seatbelts and distributing drinks, but her thoughts constantly circled back to Ava. Glared toward the main cabin, where Ava sat serenely as before, exuding an aura of peaceful authority that unnerved Miranda. Meanwhile, Ava seemed unfazed, continuing to stare out the window and every so often writing down a note in her notebook. Acts appeared inconsequential, but there was a subtle logic to her every move. Passengers sitting close by couldn't help but observe the stark contrast between Miranda's composed demeanor and her increasing unease. Rumors started to circulate, but no one dared to discuss the mounting tension openly. Dennis approached her in the galley once again, this time with a folded paper in his hand. His countenance was inscrutable. He whispered, "The captain wants to see you." Miranda said, her voice harder than intended, "Why?" Dennis shrugged. Miranda grudgingly made her way to the cockpit, where she was sealed off from the cabin by the door that had been closed behind her. Captain Harris, a middle-aged guy with a serene but with an air of authority, he turned to face her. His co-pilot cast a quick look in her direction before going back to the controls. "Miranda, we've received another call from the executive office," Captain Harris said with a measured tone. "My heart sank," Miranda said, as the captain held out "the customer you relocated. Miss Ava Carter is not an ordinary passenger. She has ties to the airline's board of directors. We have explicit instructions to treat her with the highest dignity for the rest of the trip." Miranda's jaw drooped, and I failed to... "From where I'm standing, it seems like you behaved without reason. That's unacceptable." Miranda opened her lips to defend herself, but she didn't say a word. "I was wondering whether you believed Captain Harris intervened with a harsher voice, or if you assumed that." "Listen closely, sir," Miranda whispered, as the captain rubbed his temples and sighed. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll return to your duties and ensure there are no further incidents when we land. Until then, do not approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary." Feeling a wave of humiliation wash over her, the captain gestured for the door. Dismissed, Miranda departed from the cockpit, her thoughts racing. She made her way back to the galley, where Dennis shot her a curious glance. Nevertheless, she chose to ignore him, collecting a tray of beverages and gathering herself into motion. As she delicately poured coffee for a first-class passenger, her hands quivered a little. She muttered an expletive before swiftly cleaning the spill off the tray. Once back in the main cabin, Ava remained mute, her every move calculated. Ava looked up at Miranda as she walked past, and for an instant, their eyes met. Miranda didn't seem malicious, but there was an unnerving tranquility in her expression, as if she knew the outcome. In response, Miranda accelerated her pace. Miranda's steps sank as she returned to the galley, her breathing irregular. She attempted to concentrate on the tasks at hand, but the overwhelming sense of helplessness and dread that she had just made the worst decision of her life kept distracting her. Miranda, who had always taken confidence in her intuition, felt her senses fail her as the captain's words resounded in her head. "You're connected to the board." The statement struck her like a blow to the stomach, and she slumped against the counter. Her Dennis, who was finishing up the snack cart arrangement, kept an eye on her from the corner of his mouth. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he said, his tone cautious but interested. Miranda paused, deciding whether to confide in him. Eventually, she sighed. "The woman I moved has ties to the board," Dennis said in a quiet voice. "The captain just told me." Miranda nodded, her face becoming pale. "I had no idea," Dennis said, his expression changing from pleasant interest to dread. "I was confused, since she didn't appear to be herself. When she realized the tone and impact of her comments, Dennis crossed his arms and spoke in a strong voice, and Miranda, who clearly belonged in first class, remained silent and unresponsive. In contrast, she pretended to be occupied with inventory as Dennis shook his head, a look of despair and doubt crossing his face. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ava looked at her watch once again. The trip was almost halfway over, but she showed no symptoms of agitation. The man across the aisle who had spoken to her earlier leaned forward slightly, and the passengers around her were becoming more curious as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, sending another brief message almost time. Leaning back in her seat, her calm demeanor remained unshaken. Even though he seemed suspicious, the guy nodded and said, "Are you sure you're okay?" The flight attendant was somewhat nervous before, and Ava's tone was courteous but strong. "I understand your concern, but everything is under control," she said with a small grin. And it made him wonder if there was more to her than what was initially apparent. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Miranda attempted to collect herself as she checked on passengers in first class. Her smile was forced and fragile, but it wasn't enough to stop her thoughts from racing. The idea that Ava had ties to the airline board was bad enough, but as Miranda made her way back to the galley to get ready for the next round of service, she couldn't help but notice Ava's composed demeanor and the lack of outbursts she had shown during the whole ordeal. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for selecting our flight for today. We are pleased to inform you that our flight is proceeding without a hitch and that we are on track to arrive at our destination on time." The captain's voice, emanating from the intercom, was composed and professional as the announcement was about to be made. The statement was mundane, but Miranda took it personally, seeing each word as a reminder of her increasing number of faults. She cast her gaze back toward the main cabin, this time meeting Ava's. Ava caught Miranda's stare for a moment, and then she gave a subtle nod, not condescending or aggressive, just reassuring, that sent shivers down Miranda's back. Miranda was beginning to comprehend Ava Carter's intentions. She was totally unprepared for it. The cabin was filled with the buzz of the aircraft engines as the trip proceeded, but Miranda couldn't ignore the tension between Ava and herself. She attempted to concentrate on her tasks, but her thoughts was confused. By feeling uneasy, she averted her gaze from the main cabin. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ava was there, as if the composed young woman were hustling something behind the scenes. Curiously, she glanced at her watch, and then at the small screen in front of her seat, which showed the flights as she bent over ever so slightly, retrieved her notebook, and started to write again, her handwriting crisp and methodical, each word carefully selected. To an outsider, it would have seemed like a normal moment, but for Ava, it was anything but. While everything was going on, Miranda's unease grew. She made her way back to the galley, where she clutched the counter with her arms crossed firmly. Dennis, who had been watching her closely during the trip, finally had the courage to speak out. "You've been tense ever since that phone call," he remarked. Tone low but strong. "What's really happening?" Miranda stopped, her gaze darting to the curtain that divided the main cabin from the galley. "I told you already," she murmured. "The passenger I moved has important connections." Dennis raised an eyebrow, and the conversation continued. Miranda's defensiveness betrayed her. You assumed she didn't belong in first class, and now you're paying for it. The captain got involved because of that, not because of the connections. It's a warning. What did you do to her? I didn't do anything. I've been with this airline for years, and if you cross someone powerful, you better be ready to deal with the fallout. Miranda clenched her jaw, her anger building up. She didn't appear to be like Dennis, someone wealthy enough to. As Dennis resumed his duties, Miranda froze, her hands clenching the counter so tightly that they turned white. He shook his head and sighed heavily, saying, "You should have left her alone. You've made a mess that's way bigger than you realize." Ava remained seated serenely, her notebook now closed and stashed away. The slight smile on her face had vanished, replaced by a look of tranquility, and Miranda felt a surge of panic wash over her. She understood he was correct, but by then it was too late to reverse her actions. In the nick of time, a chime resounded throughout the cabin, sending shivers down Miranda's spine. However, she quickly composed herself and grabbed for the glayphone, her hands quivering slightly. "Glay, this is Miranda," she replied, her voice strained but unshakable. Miranda's breath caught in her throat as the captain and the other voice announced that they had received additional communication from the executive office requesting that Miss Carter be given full priority service for the rest of the flight. The captain wanted to make sure that Carter was comfortable and personally apologized for any earlier inconvenience. Dragging herself out of her daze, Randa summoned what little composure she had left and managed to answer, "Yes, sir," before hanging up. The weight of the situation was crushing down on her, and she remained still for a while. Miranda emerged from the galley, trembling hands gripping a tray containing a glass of sparkling water, aware that the power dynamic had changed dramatically. She felt helpless as she contemplated approaching Ava once more. Rather than the usual poise, she was visibly tense as she trudged toward the main cabin, each step burdened by the weight of her previous decisions. She sensed that this wasn't simply about delivering water. Rather, it was an unspoken admission that she had crossed a boundary when she arrived at Ava's. Miranda started speaking with a voice that was softer than anybody on the table, while Ava stared up at her, her countenance serene and inscrutable. The tension between them appeared to grow as Miranda pushed a grin that almost reached her eyes. Ava raised her head slightly, her eyes keen but cool, and spoke again, saying, "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble earlier. I had heard about this before and I wanted to apologize personally." Miranda, with an air of calm yet firmness, failed in her forced grin as she put the glass of sparkling water on Ava's tray table. Ava looked at Miranda and said, "Yes, I apologize for interrupting your experience. Please accept this as my token of my gratitude." Her tone was neutral, but the words struck Miranda like a slap. She gulped hard, her palms starting to sweat, and she looked back at Miranda, thanking her. "It's going to take more than a drink to fix this," she said simply. Stuttered, "Please inform me if there is anything else I can do to make this right." Ava took a while to react, leaning back in her seat and seemingly watching Miranda as if she were planning her next move. The awkward quiet caused Miranda to squirm uncomfortably, but eventually Ava cracked a slight grin. Ava finally spoke up, but she believes the airline will handle this properly after we land. Miranda's stomach dropped at the mention of the airline, which was a clear sign that Ava wasn't letting the incident go. "I understand," Miranda whispered. With her head down and her cheeks flushed from embarrassment, Miranda hurried back to the galley as fast as she could without running, her mind racing with the consequences of Ava's comments. It was obvious that something was wrong, was still not resolved, and she had no say over what happened next. In the meantime, Ava delicately picked up the glass of sparkling water, took a small sip, and placed it back down. Her expression showed no signs of anxiety or panic to the other passengers, but deep down, Ava was anything but. In the galley, Miranda leaned pallid against the counter and shook her head, her words barely audible, as if to say, "I'm not done. I'm going to take this." Dennis arched an eyebrow, wondering how things had gone. Miranda remained silent as she fixed her gaze on the curtain that divided the galley from the main cabin, her thoughts racing with a newfound understanding. Dennis let out a heavy sigh, his countenance becoming grim. "I warned you, folks like her don't play games," he said. The realization hit Miranda like a ton of bricks as she sat in the galley, her mind racing with memories of the flight and the immense power that Ava Carter possessed. It was the most intimate moment of her life, and she was about to face the consequences of her lack of confidence. Dennis, who had seen Miranda's vulnerability during her time at the airline, cautiously maneuvered around her, periodically casting her a worried look without saying a word. He obviously understood the seriousness of the situation and that Miranda was totally unprepared. Meanwhile, in sitting tall and composed, Ava closed her notebook and carefully put it back in her bag. She seemed to be getting ready for something, even though she could hear the faint hum of whispered conversations around her. However, she paid no attention to them because her focus remained unwavering. "Please make sure that your trays are upright and that your seat belts are secured. We will be commencing our descent soon." The intercom rang again, this time with the captain's voice exuding a clear sense of authority. The announcement sparked a rush of activity as people repositioned themselves in their seats and made sure their possessions were safe. Clara, the flight attendant who had previously attempted to land, made a triumphant return to Ava's row, where she smiled warmly, but seemed somewhat uneasy. "Is there anything more I can do for you before we land?" Ava kindly declined and thanked Clara, who had been quite kind. Clara's cheeks became a little red at the praise, but she reassured Ava that she would be happy to help with anything she needed before leaving to continue her journey. Miranda, in first class, was occupied with the last inspections before landing. Her actions were robotic, and she attempted to maintain an expressionless neutrality, but her mind was racing with dread. Ava's soothing voice had soothed her, but the tension in the cabin was hard to miss. As the plane dipped below the clouds, Ava peered out the window and watched the cityscape of their destination emerge into view, her fingers tracing the lines. The captain's earlier directive and Ava's subtle but powerful words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. She could feel the eyes of Dennis and the other flight attendants fixed on her, but no one spoke a word. Perched delicately on the armrest, her manner as composed as usual, Ava felt completely in command. Despite the mayhem Miranda was enduring, the whole flight had transpired just as planned, and she was prepared for what lay ahead once the aircraft landed. Upon touching down, the passengers let out a collective breath of relief as they retrieved their luggage from the overhead compartments and undid their seatbelts. The air was filled with the normal rustling and chatting, but there was an underlying tension, particularly for Miranda, who was well aware of Ava's whereabouts and the consequences that would follow from her actions. Ava sat motionlessly, reached into her luggage, and pulled out her phone, sending a brief message that said, "We've landed, be ready." Miranda's stomach twisted as she glanced toward the front of the plane, where she saw Miranda stationed near the exit. The cabin doors opened, letting in the cool air from the jet bridge. Passengers filed out in a systematic fashion, with the murmurs of casual. As the sound of conversation mixed with the clanking of luggage handles, Miranda stood rigidly, smiling at every passenger who went by. Her heart was racing as she awaited Ava's arrival. Ava patiently waited until the aisle was almost empty before standing up, gathering her belongings with the help of her. With the same composed precision she had shown throughout the journey, Ava made her way to the doorway. The rest of the crew, including Clara and Dennis, exchanged knowing looks. It seemed like something big was about to happen. As Ava approached the exit, Miranda straightened up. Miranda, her voice quivering slightly, thanked Ava for traveling with them and continued, "I'm sure we'll be in touch." Ava stopped, her countenance calm, but her eyes keen, and her reply was smooth, but it sent a shiver down Miranda's spine because it lacked. With that, Ava disembarked from the aircraft, leaving Miranda paralyzed. Dennis gingerly approached her, asking, "Are you all right?" His tone betrayed his knowledge of the answer, but Miranda remained silent, her expressionless eyes fixated on the open door, as if anticipating something. 2 uniformed security agents boarded the aircraft shortly after, their presence immediately drawing attention. They surveyed the cabin before zeroing in on Miranda. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them whispered under her breath. Dennis stood by in quiet contemplation as the officer firmly said, "We have some questions regarding an incident on this flight." Miranda's face became pale as the weight of her actions finally settled on her. "We need you to come with us," she whispered. Ava waited quietly outside the gate in the airport, holding her phone, while the cops walked Miranda off the aircraft. Her rigid stance revealed her mounting panic, and the rest of the crew exchanged anxious looks, not knowing what to do next. As Ava turned and made her way toward the baggage claim, her strides deliberate and unwavering, she didn't bother to glance back. The message she had conveyed earlier had accomplished its goal. Just as she had envisioned, the once bustling airport terminal now stood in stark contrast to the tranquility that had engulfed Miranda as she was led away by the security guards. The other passengers on the plane started to scatter, many of them staring in astonishment at what was happening. There were murmurs in the air, but no one dared to approach Ava as she composedly made her way to baggage claim. Her movements were purposeful, as if she were already 2 steps ahead of everyone else. In a little stark room at the security holding area, Miranda sat. Near the door, surrounded by a single table and 2 chairs, stood the officers who had escorted Miranda off the plane. Their expressions were professional, but Stern's mind raced as she attempted to make sense of what had just happened. In what felt like an instant, she had gone from being a respected flight attendant to being the subject of an investigation. Breaking the heavy pause, one of the policemen came up and said, "Miss Scott, we've been informed of an incident involving a first-class passenger on your flight. The airlines have been notified." It struck her like a ton of bricks that this wasn't simply a misunderstanding, it was a premeditated reaction. According to the reports we've received, the passenger you removed from first class was Ava Carter. "Were you aware of this?" Miranda responded with a dry throat and a trembling voice. "I don't know what this is about. I was just doing my job." The officer raised an eyebrow in response. Because of her position, Miranda's heart fell even deeper. "I didn't know," at first, her voice was barely audible, "that Miss Carter is not just a high-ranking executive. I found out during the flight." When the officer moved forward slightly, his stare steadfast, affiliated with this airline and a major shareholder. "Her grievance has already been brought to the attention of the board, who treat accusations of prejudice and mistreatment with the utmost seriousness." Miranda's expression darkened as she prepared to reply, but she remained silent as the officer's tone hardened. "There is documentation supporting Carter's version of events, and other passengers have confirmed her story. We're giving you a chance to present your side of the story, but I want you to know that this will not be treated lightly." Miranda's hands quivered as she clutched the edge of the table, and she wanted to explain what had happened and defend herself, but the words came out steaming out of her mouth. Deep down, she knew there was no valid reason. She had made an impulsive decision that had cost her more than she had anticipated. Meanwhile, Ava stood at baggage claim. By the carousel, she listened intently, nodding slightly. as the other party explained that the security team had detained her for questioning. "Make sure the board reviews the footage and statements. I want the matter resolved professionally but thoroughly," she said, her voice containing a note of finality despite the calmness of her delivery. As the conversation came to a close, Ava went for her sleek black purse and said, "Please send a copy of the final report to my office." She emphasized her want to make sure that this never happened to her or anyone else. As she deftly retrieved her carried-on, a handful of flight attendants observed her with an air of intrigue and admiration. Nevertheless, she paid them no mind, preoccupied as always with plotting her next move through the terminal's customary mayhem. Many people coming and going, but Ava persevered with determination. She had transformed a racist and humiliating episode into a chance for responsibility and structural reform, and she was far from finished. For an unforgettable showdown that neither Miranda nor the airline would soon forget, Miranda sat in the sterile room, her shallow breaths betraying the immense pressure of the situation. The officers granted her a moment to gather herself, but the oppressive stillness of the room made it more difficult with each passing second to regain her composure. She eventually spoke, her voice barely audible, and her posture betrayed her anxiety. "I didn't intend for this to happen," Miranda said, her eyes darting between the police. "I was just following protocol." The officer next to her moved forward, his attitude warning her that she didn't belong in first class. Her lips opened as if to speak, but Miranda halted. She couldn't bring herself to accept that her assumption had been founded on unconscious prejudice. "I don't know," she mumbled, and she didn't act. Just because someone isn't behaving like the other first-class customers doesn't mean they should be moved to a separate area, particularly if their ticket is genuine. Did she breach any rules? The officer glanced at his colleague before responding. Miranda, her hands sweating profusely, shook her head in disapproval. The officer had no authority to cut her off. "Therefore you behaved without reason. Miss Carter had every right to stay in the seat she had paid for, and your actions have made a terrible situation for the airline." Standing there, Miranda felt her heart sink as the weight of his words hit her. She wanted to argue in defense, but the facts were incontestable. Her decision had been based on an assumption, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, Ava had left the terminal and was now at the A's. She stood on the curb. A fast black car arrived. A well-dressed man came out to meet Miss Carter, and he nodded politely. "Everything has been arranged according to your instructions, thank you," he said as he climbed into the rear seat. After entering, Grace, as usual, pulled out her phone and started going through her emails. One notification from the airline board stood out, so she opened it right away. The email was brief but to the point, outlining the board's plans to deal with the incident, which included conducting a formal review. Ava's lips formed a subtle grin as she expressed her contentment with the airline training standards and the guarantee that Miranda's activities would not be left unchecked. Ava had no desire for revenge. Rather, she aimed for responsibility and change, and it seemed that she had already begun to make headway at the airport. After the officers finished questioning Miranda, they stood up and were about to leave the room when they abruptly made a final statement. They informed Miranda that the matter would be escalated to the airline disciplinary committee and threatened her with a suspension from duty until they made a decision. As the officers left the room, Miranda was left to think about her situation on her own. This was the moment when she realized how much she had underestimated Ava Carter. At the same time, Ava's car smoothly pulled away from the terminal, blending into the stream of traffic. Ava had a profound feeling of fulfillment as she gazed out the window, her mind at peace and clear. The day had been draining, but she had remained firm and by doing so had opened the door to change. Suddenly her phone rang, interrupting her reverie. It was Ava examined the message thoroughly before replying, Good, let's make sure this never happens again. As the city skyline came into view, she leaned in to read the confirmation that the airline board would be conducting a full review of the incident and implementing new sensitivity training for their staff. After the officers had departed, Miranda remained in the cramped room, staring blankly at the table before her, feeling the weight of the suspension as she let out a small breath. She knew that her actions today would impact the airline, and, one could only hope, all of its employees. As the investigation drew near and the gravity of her actions became clear, she felt a crushing weight descend on her as she relived the events of that day, her confidence eroding with each passing second. What had appeared to be an instinctive judgment moments before felt like a disastrous error as her phone beeped. Interrupting her train of thought, she drew back before answering the phone, fully aware that the message contained a disciplinary hearing set for tomorrow at 9 a.m. from the airline's Human Resources Department, and that whatever was on the other end of the line would not be good. More information will be sent to you by email. Her palm quivered as she read the message, the gravity of her situation sinking in. Miranda felt like she was being used as a shield at the hearing, but she also knew that nothing she could say would be able to stop the airline from defending its reputation. Meanwhile, Ava's car had shown up at her office. A sleek skyscraper in the heart of the city welcomed her with a grin and a stack of paperwork. Maya, her assistant, greeted her with a smile and handed her a folder containing the board's first evaluation of the occurrence. Statements from the crew and modifications to training programs have been implemented swiftly. Ava, who was looking contemplative as she glanced through the paperwork, nodded and calmly said that they aren't ignoring the situation. It's a positive development, but Maya was hesitant before speaking carefully. Will she fight back against the flight attendant? Ava was silent as she considered the question. She may have finally closed the folder, but the focus has shifted to the system that enabled someone like her to feel. Maya nodded, her appreciation for Ava plainly visible. It was clear that Ava had already made an impression, and the board was taking their responsibility seriously as a result. Ava smiled slightly, but remained silent, clearly knowing her job. Returning to the airport, Miranda, her legs trembling, departed the holding area. She avoided making eye contact with the cops and airport officials as she made her way out, demonstrating that systemic change still needed aid and patience, both of which Ava had in plenty. Miranda's mind raced as she sat in her car, her uniform serving as a stark reminder of the career that now hung precariously. She had spent years cultivating a reputation as a competent and devoted flight attendant, and now the journey to her car felt like a walk of shame. Everything was falling apart as Miranda considered Ava, who seemed unflappable and unwavering. Then it hit her like a ton of bricks. Ava had always been in command, even from the moment Miranda messed up her first time around. She finally gave in to a different emotion, a heavy pang of sorrow. She had failed to appreciate Ava Carter for more than her role as a passenger. Now she was bearing the brunt of her ignorance. Miranda departed from the airport as Ava remained in her office, going over the paperwork Maya had given her. Suddenly her phone rang again. This time it was the airline CEO, wanting to meet face-to-face to discuss the event and the next steps. In a brief response, Ava scribbled, "I'll make time tomorrow." After putting her phone down, Ava leaned back in her chair, her thoughts already turning to the future. The events of the day had been exhausting, but they had also presented a chance to change the culture of an entire organization. For Ava, that was a battle worth fighting for. Ava had spent the night reviewing documents, drafting statements, and considering the broader implications of the incident to herself. This wasn't just about addressing the CEO of the airline. As the morning sun spilled through the blinds in her office, casting long shadows on her desk, she prepared for the meeting. From her own personal experience, It was about making it clear that no one should have to undergo the kind of abuse she did at precisely 10 a.m., regardless of their position or background. Maya, her assistant, led CEO Richard Hale into the room. Hale was a towering, tall guy in his late 50s, with silver-streak hair and an air of polished confidence. But underneath his calm appearance, you could see the anxiety in his every motion. Richard started his speech with caution and controlled tone. Ava shook his hand, her countenance composed but determined. "I admire your seriousness about this situation," she said. "Mr. Hale, please take a seat." While Richard adjusted his tie and took a seat across from her, Ava nodded, in agreement. "Let me express my deepest apologies for what happened on your flight. It was completely unacceptable. The root of the problem lies not in the actions of a single flight attendant, but in the culture that enabled her to rationalize her bad decision-making." "I'm relieved to hear that, but apologies won't solve the problem on their own. You're completely correct, and that's why we've already started reviewing all of our policies and training programs. We're also making sensitivity and bias training mandatory for all employees, and we'll be reviewing our internal reporting procedures to make sure they're better." Richard's expression tightened slightly, but he nodded in agreement. Responsibility Ava sat back in her chair, quietly observing him. "It's a start," she said, "but it wasn't good enough. I want a detailed timeline for these changes, as well as regular updates on their progress. I expect to see measurable results." Richard hesitated for a second before nodding. "Of course we'll." Richard meticulously took notes as Ava laid out her expectations, and the meeting dragged on for another hour. By the time it was over, Ava had let a small smile slip her lips. "Good," she said. "Let's make sure this becomes a turning point for your organization, not just a one-time correction." Concluded with a sense of purpose in the room as Richard rose to leave. With a look of true respect in his eyes, he extended his hand again, this time thanking Ava for holding them accountable. Richard then said, "We will make this right." Ava shook his hand firmly, saying, "I will hold you to that." Maya then entered the room. Ava looked around the room, her interest palpable, and she said with a blend of comfort and resolve, "It went well, but this is just the beginning." Starting while Ava's meeting continued, Miranda sat in an immaculate conference room at the Airlines. As she waited at the headquarters for her disciplinary hearing to start, the suspension weighed heavily on her. Her fear was heightened by the combination of the black cloud and the room's silence. Before her lay a stack of documents, each one describing her conduct on the trip and the complaints that followed. The door swung open as Ava Carter moved in, and a trio of senior airline one of the executives was a woman, and she entered her bland but forceful demeanor. First to speak, Miss Scott thanked him, her features angular and her demeanor authoritative. "Thank you for joining us today as we address the tragic events of Flight 287, and Miranda, her throat parched, nodded faintly in response to the accusations leveled against her. She said in a barely audible whisper, and the executive started to Miranda was asked to give her version of what transpired by ringing the chronology of events. She attempted to clarify her acts, but her statement sounded hollow, even to her ears. "I worried that she might have I was only sitting in the incorrect chair," Miranda remarked, her voice quivering. In an effort to adhere to procedure, the executive with the sharp features raised an eyebrow. Miss Carter submitted a legitimate first-class diploma, as per our records. "Ticket." Miranda was hesitant to urge her to relocate until you confirmed this. I felt my palms go wet when she finally confessed, and the room became quiet as the weight a middle-aged guy wearing spectacles leaned forward as Miss Scott made her admission. "Another executive, your acts not only went against the airline's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, but they also caused damage to our credibility. Are you aware of the gravity of the situation?" Miranda slowly nodded. Regrettably, the panel persisted in interrogating her. Miranda felt completely defeated by the conclusion of the hearing due to their professional but unwavering tone. Though she anticipated receiving written notification of the decision, she had already come to terms with the fact that her career with the flight had ended. And as Miranda departed from the room, thoughts of Ava, the calm lady whose dignity she had preserved despite Miranda's use of it, Miranda finally experienced the crushing consequences of her choices, both professionally and personally. Although she wanted to place responsibility on the system or her intuition, the reality was that she had later, when Ava sat in her office, she faced the repercussions of her decision. The tone of the email was very evident when she sipped her tea that afternoon and studied it from the airplane board. Here is a chronology of the steps they took to show how seriously they took reform, modifications to the plan that Ava had asked for, such as the introduction of required training programs and updates to their Ava and the complaint processing mechanisms, achieved a little but significant victory, gave herself permission to enjoy a moment of contentment before her phone chimed, interrupting her moment of delight. I thought you may be interested to hear that Maya Miranda Scott has been formally fired. As Ava leaned down to look at the message, she realized it had no joy for her, and did that seem like a genuine resolution? Ava wasn't naturally spiteful, and she was aware. Although it was a symptom, Miranda's firing was merely one part of a much bigger issue. Needed to take a step back and admit that her actions had repercussions perched in her chair, contemplating the whirlwind of events that had transpired in the last 24 hours. She had made the snap choice to, motivated by more than simply a desire to get revenge. It was all about demonstrating, with the goal of helping the airline and anybody else in a similar situation. Ava decided to take matters into her own hands and just sent a brief message to Maya. I appreciate you informing me. Now, let's not lose sight of the broader picture. Imagine Miranda sitting in her cramped apartment that night with the airline's termination letter laying before her on the table. She had spent countless hours mentally reliving the hearing, expecting to discover a rationale for her deeds, but alas, there was none. The truth was stark and certain, and she had lost her friends and family due to her prejudiced ideas. They began to send letters that were loaded with both compassion and criticism, and Miranda just couldn't bring herself to respond. She struggled for years to answer, feeling alone and burdened by the consequences of her errors. Took great satisfaction in her previous work as an accomplished professional who meticulously adhered to all policies and procedures. Nonetheless, all of that seems pointless, so she switched on the TV to divert her attention. But suddenly, she stumbled into a news piece about prejudice in the workplace. It seemed like the world was trying to get her. Facing the consequences of her actions, the show included an interview with Ava Carter, who articulated her thoughts on the Miranda gaped at the screen, her expression betraying her dissatisfaction with the current system. As Ava's chest constricted, her composed expression and clear speech contrasted sharply. When Miranda first met Ava, it was in stark contrast to her own internal anguish. Opponent, but as a person with the right to seek better treatment for herself, and Miranda sat in quiet, knowing she couldn't join the others in turning off the TV. Reverse her actions, but maybe she could get some insight from them. She grabbed her laptop and started typing, an email she sent for the airline board, but rather of focusing on defending herself, she wrote a sincere remorse to Ava, and everyone else her acts harmed. For Miranda finally felt some clarity after days of fog. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could choose her actions moving forward. As time went on, Ava got a surprise email the week after, with the subject line, "Apology from." The airline board sent it to her. Curious, the former employee opened it and started reading. The sender was Miss Carter. I am very sorry for the way I treated you. It all began with an apology from Miranda Scott. My behavior on the flight was very unacceptable. I relied on assumptions instead of facts. And I failed to recognize you as an esteemed traveler, and more significantly, my actions brought disgrace onto an individual who was deserving of respect, and not only on myself. Component placement. I apologize to Ava for reading the email, but it is the airline's policy generally. Paying close attention to the sincere tone, Miranda continued by describing how the incident's aftermath had compelled her taking the time to think about what she did and how it affected others. She acknowledged her prejudices and stated her goal to further her education and improve oneself. This experience has humbled her. I've realized that the reforms you're calling for are really necessary in many other areas as well. Airline. But wherever I go, I pray that my ill-advised deeds might set a precedent for what needs to change. I'm dedicated to studying up and making sure I never make the same mistake again. I appreciate you keeping me accountable. Responsible Ava finished the email and slumped back in her chair, her mind racing. She wasn't stupid. She knew it is common for individuals to offer an apology in an effort to alleviate feelings of guilt or restore their reputation. However, there is something about Ava couldn't deny that Miranda argued for a while, and her remarks had an authentic quality to them. Taking a few moments to gather my thoughts before writing a quick reply to express my gratitude for your post-development, I wish you the best of luck as you go on and draw wisdom from this ordeal. With a sense of optimism for what lies ahead, Ava stowed her laptop and stared out. The event from her perspective was about more than simply personal justice. It pertained to causing a chain reaction. And while Miranda's apologies did not change the past, they did suggest that Ava understood that even the smallest of actions might eventually lead to a larger transformation. Weeks went by, and the event on aircraft 287's ripple effects, the airline's first round of required sensitivity training, was starting to take effect with the public announcement of anti-discrimination training sessions for all employees and a statement responsibility. The message tactfully and politely emphasized Ava's involvement in advocating for these modifications, cast her in a positive light, encouraging transformation rather than a negative one. Prompted discussions amongst aviation industry professionals. Several other airlines started evaluating their own rules, and a number sought advice from Ava directly, but she turned down most requests, instead concentrating. Her focus should have been on making sure that her work with this airline was completely achieved, not on seeking personal praise. It was all about making an impression that would remain. Nava was back at the airport, getting ready to take a trip for a business meeting. She noted a little change in the staff's interaction with passengers as she got closer to the gate. Sincere grins and thoughtful responses to each inquiry. It wasn't flawless, nor was any system, but it was an improvement, and that was a beginning when Ava. Upon reaching the gate, the agent instantly recognized her, Miss Carter, and welcomed her return. As a gesture of gratitude for your ongoing support, we have upgraded your seat, they stated with a kind smile, and Ava grinned. Thank you for the kind gesture, but I'm perfectly comfortable with gently blowing it off. She responded, where am I? With the same blend of self-assurance and modesty that she normally displays. Thing Ava saw as Drew boarded the plane, respect without demanding it. There were noticeable shifts in the crew's demeanor. They were more involved and attentive. Passengers, she sat down silently and watched the others settle down across the aisle almost instantly. A flight attendant helped a young lady who was having trouble finding room for her suitcase in the overhead compartment. Helped her out. Ava could hear Clara's comforting voice in theirs. Ava had made sure that Clara's professionalism was shown, since she had been the only attendant during her struggle to show her care. While Ava was having meetings with the board, she saw Clara, who had been elevated to a senior position, standing toward the front of the room. The cabin attendant overseeing the boarding procedure with an air of calm assurance. As a glance of appreciation passed between them, Clara smiled and met Ava's gaze. Gently nodded in return, an unsaid sign of mutual regard for one another. It was instances like this that served as a reminder to Ava of the reasons for her determination to advocate for even the most modest of change's actions, when escalated, have the potential to revolutionize a whole civilization. Much as the aircraft departed, Ava reclined on her chair, thinking back on her ordeal. She reflected on the trip and everything that had transpired since then, including Miranda's apologies, the structural improvements, and the receiving encouraging notes from complete strangers who had heard her tale was both humbling and uplifting. Across town, Miranda was starting a new chapter in her life after landing a position with a non-profit whose mission is to promote diversity and inclusion in the workplace throughout her journey as an example of transformation, which was far from smooth. And for the first time in her life, Miranda had a feeling of purpose. Even though she knew she had a lot to prove, throughout her life she was resolute in her desire to have a positive impact on a broader scale. At an altitude of 30,000 feet, Ava retrieved her notepad, turned to a blank page, and jotted down a single line. Change starts with taking responsibility, but it flourishes when you keep at it. And eventually close the meanwhile, she gave herself permission to enjoy a rare moment of tranquility while seeing the seemingly limitless sky from the window. There was still a lot of work to be done, and the war was far from finished. However, as she saw as Ava looked up into the seemingly infinite sky, she experienced a feeling she hadn't anticipated: hope. Although the events of that trip were traumatic, they had ignited a fire that extended far beyond her. In that instant, the sky was not the limit, Ava realized with serene confidence. It was just the firstly. I want to say thank you for tuning in.